The man who rode into Dusty Creek, Texas on the morning of April 3, 1882, wore his solitude like a second coat, deliberately, and with no intention of taking it off. Nelson Barnett was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that only years of hard riding and harder living could carve a man, with dark eyes that had learned somewhere along the road to give away nothing. His horse, a bay gelding named Cutter, was the only creature on earth Nelson spoke to with any regularity, and even those conversations were brief. He had ridden up from the Brazos River country through 3 days of dust and April wind, and he had ridden alone by choice, which was the only way Nelson Barnett had traveled for the better part of 6 years. He was not running from anything specific anymore. That was the thing people never quite understood about a man like him. He was not fleeing a tragedy or a crime or a broken heart. He had simply arrived at a place in his life where needing other people felt like a liability he could no longer afford, and so he had quietly, methodically, stripped those needs away one by one until almost nothing was left. It suited him. He told himself it suited him every single morning he woke up alone under whatever sky happened to be above him, and by now he had repeated the telling so many times that most days he almost believed it. He needed work. That was the only reason he had ridden into Dusty Creek rather than passing straight through it. He had heard in the last town, a miserable little collection of warped boards and broken promises called Reliance, that a man named Horace Delmer was looking for a ranch hand with experience breaking horses. Nelson had plenty of that. He could break a horse the way other men cracked knuckles, efficiently and without ceremony. He planned to work Delmer's ranch through the spring season, collect his wages resupply, and move on before anyone in Dusty Creek had time to form any opinions about him worth repeating. That was the plan. He tied Cutter outside the general store on the main road, which was a wide dirt track that ran between 2 rows of modest wooden buildings. There was a blacksmith shop with a forge already glowing orange in the morning cool. There was a small church with a bell that needed paint. There was a saloon called the Copper Spur that had its shutters still closed. There was a dry goods merchant, a livery stable, a post office the size of a closet, and one building slightly larger than the rest, with a hand-painted sign above its door that read Langston's Eating House and Dry Goods. Nelson was looking for the general store to ask about directions to the Delmer Ranch, but as he stepped up onto the front porch of the nearest establishment, he nearly collided with a woman carrying a crate of glass jars so large she could barely see over the top of it. He caught the crate before it fell. She caught her balance. They stood there for one suspended moment with the crate between them, his hands on one side of it and her hands on the other, and Nelson found himself looking at a woman with flour on her left cheek, dark copper hair escaping from a braid down her back, and brown eyes that were sharp enough to cut leather. "I had it," she said. Her voice was not unfriendly. It was simply honest. "You nearly didn't," he said. She studied him for one brief second, the way a woman who has been alone and capable for a long time studies a stranger, cataloging, measuring, deciding. Then she tilted her head toward the door she'd come out of and said, "You can set it just inside if you don't mind." The porch step is the part that always gets me. He carried the crate inside because it was the reasonable thing to do, not because he intended to start a conversation. He set it on the counter she indicated, turned to leave, and heard her say from behind him, "You're new, passing through or staying?" "Working," he said without turning around. "The Delmer Ranch, do you know where it sits?" "I do," she said. "About 4 miles east, just past the creek crossing at the old Cottonwood. You'll smell the horse yard before you see it." He nodded once and walked back out the door. That was the first time Nelson Barnett spoke to Pearl Langston. He did not think much of it as he rode east toward the Delmer Ranch. She was just a woman running a shop in a town he was passing through. He had met dozens like her. Towns in West Texas were full of capable women running things while their husbands were absent or dead or both. He noted only that she had flour on her cheek, and that she had not seemed particularly impressed by him, which he appreciated. People who were immediately impressed by strangers were always trying to get something from them afterward. Horace Delmer was a heavy-set man of about 50 with a red face and a genuine handshake who hired Nelson on the spot after watching him spend 4 minutes with a half-broken roan that had been throwing every other hand who tried her. Nelson communicated something to horses through his hands and his stillness that he could not have explained in words, and the roan settled under his touch with the particular kind of surrender that was not defeat but recognition. Delmer offered him a fair wage, a bunk in the hands' quarters, and 2 meals a day. Nelson accepted, unsaddled Cutter, and began. The work was good. Hard and physical and silent in the way that honest outdoor labor is silent, broken only by the sound of hooves in dirt and wind through the horseyard fencing. There were 2 other hands at the Delmer ranch, a quiet Mexican man named Eduardo who had been there 11 years and spoke very little English and needed none, and a young man of 19 named Teddy Crane who talked constantly and harmlessly, and whom Nelson tolerated the way he tolerated weather, as an ambient condition of existence. On his second day in Dusty Creek, Nelson rode back to town in the afternoon because Delmer needed a particular kind of iron clip from the blacksmith that Eduardo could not pick up since Eduardo was needed at the ranch. It was a simple errand. Nelson went to the blacksmith, collected the clips, and was walking Cutter back along the main road when he heard voices rising from the direction of Langston's eating house. He would have kept walking. He truly would have. But one of the voices had a quality to it, a low, pressuring quality that people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something that is not reasonable at all. That made him slow his horse without fully meaning to. Through the open front window of the eating house, he could see Pearl Langston standing behind her counter, and a man he did not recognize standing on the customer side of it. The man was heavy-set in a different way than Delmer, not working heavy, but sitting heavy, dressed in a good suit that had been expensive at some point, and was now showing the slow decay of a man who had stopped taking care of things. He had a gold watch chain and a thin mouth, and he was speaking at Pearl in a way that had nothing to do with ordering food. "Your father's agreement was clear," the man was saying. "3 years have passed since his passing, Miss Langston. The arrangement stands." "My father's arrangement was with my father," Pearl said. Her voice was steady, but Nelson could hear the effort in it. "I was not a party to it, and I do not intend to honor something I never agreed to. You operate this business on land that I own, Mr. Whitfield, legally and entirely. My father left it to me in his will, which was recorded at the county seat. You are welcome to ride there and read it yourself." The man named Whitfield let a silence sit between them like a stone, then said very quietly, "Things can become difficult, Miss Langston, for a woman running a business alone in a town like this. I'm simply saying." Nelson had not moved. He was not sure why he was still listening. He was not the type of man who inserted himself into other people's disputes, which were none of his business and not what he was being paid to involve himself in. He watched Pearl Langston look at Whitfield with those sharp brown eyes and say, without flinching, "Then let them become difficult. I have managed difficult before." Whitfield put his hat on and walked out the door without another word, passing close enough to Nelson that Nelson could see the flat, calculating displeasure on his face. The man gave Nelson a glance of casual assessment, the way men like that glance at strangers when they are trying to decide if the stranger is a problem, and then he walked off down the road. Nelson did not go inside. He rode back to the Delmer ranch with the iron clips, and he put the whole thing out of his mind, or he tried to. He found himself thinking about the steadiness in Pearl Langston's voice, not fearless exactly, but something more interesting than fearless. Something that knew what fear was and chose to stand up inside it anyway. He did not go back into town until the 3rd day, when Delmer sent him for more supplies from the general store. The eating house was open, and through the window he could see it was doing modest but genuine business. 3 men at the long wooden table eating what smelled like beef stew, A woman with a baby picking up a wrapped parcel. Nelson went to the general store, got the supplies, loaded them in the pack saddle, and then, without any clear reason he could have defended rationally, he pushed open the door of Langston's eating house and stepped inside. The smell of it hit him first. Biscuits and coffee and something with cinnamon in it, and the smell of a wood fire kept at exactly the right temperature. It was the kind of smell that got in under a man's defenses because it was not trying to get under anything. It was simply the smell of a place where food was made with attention. Pearl was behind the long counter that served both as the selling counter for dry goods and the serving area for the eating portion of the establishment. She looked up when he came in with the same measuring look she'd given him on the porch, and then a brief flicker of recognition. "The horseman," she said. "Nelson Barnett," he said, though he was not sure why he gave his name since he had not intended to stay long enough for it to be relevant. "Pearl Langston," she said, in a tone that suggested she was completing a formality rather than making a gift of the information. "You eating or shopping?" He had already eaten at the ranch. He was not hungry. He sat down at the near end of the long table and said, "Coffee, if you have it." She poured it without making anything of the moment, set the cup in front of him, and went back to whatever she had been doing at the other end of the counter, which appeared to be writing figures in a ledger with a very focused expression. Nelson drank the coffee. It was excellent coffee, dark and not bitter, which was rarer than it should have been in West Texas in 1882. After a few minutes, the other customers finished and left, and it was just the two of them in the room with the sound of the fire and the distant noise of the street. "Was that Whitfield I saw you talking to yesterday?" Nelson said. He was not sure why he said it. He had not planned to. Pearl looked up from her ledger. "You were riding by." "I was. I don't make a habit of other people's business." "But," she said, "he didn't look like a man who was there to buy a meal." She considered him for a moment. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the thoughtful caution of someone who had learned that opening up to strangers rarely simplified anything. Then she put down her pen and said, "Silas Whitfield believes he has a claim on this building and the land it sits on, based on an agreement he made with my father 7 years ago that was never written down and never signed. My father died 3 years ago and left everything to me. Whitfield has been coming around every few months to remind me that he has a long memory and a lot of friends in this county." "Does he?" "Enough of them to make things inconvenient," she said. "Not enough to make things impossible, so far." Nelson drank more of his coffee. Outside, a horse walked by slowly. "He said things could become difficult." "He's been saying that for 3 years, Pearl said, and picked up her pen again. "I'm still here." There was something in the way she said it that was not bravado. It was simply a fact she had assembled about herself through testing. Nelson looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he rarely looked at anyone, and saw a woman of perhaps 25 or 26 who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten strong enough from the carrying that she no longer noticed the weight. He felt something shift in his chest, very slightly, like a door that had been stuck moving an inch and then stopping. He put down his coin for the coffee, nodded to her, and left. He told himself that evening, lying in his bunk while Teddy Crane talked about a girl in the next town with the relentless enthusiasm of the young, that he had no interest in Pearl Langston, beyond a general human acknowledgement that her situation was difficult, and that Whitfield was the kind of man who gave other men a bad reputation. He had no interest in her establishment or her problems. He was there to break horses for Horace Delmer and then move on. He had a pattern, and the pattern worked. The pattern had been working for 6 years, and the fact that some woman made good coffee and looked at strangers like she was reading them for fine print was not a compelling reason to deviate from what worked. He fell asleep telling himself this and woke up the next morning thinking about the flower that had been on her left cheek on the first morning, and the way she had said, without any drama at all, "I am still here." The 4th day was a Saturday, which meant Dusty Creek was busier than usual. Farmers and ranch families came into town on Saturdays for supplies and company, and by mid-morning the main road had a lively population of horses, wagons, dogs, and children. Nelson had a half-day off because Delmer had gone to Abilene on business and the horsework was caught up. He rode into town because he wanted a new pair of work gloves from the general store, and for no other reason. He got the gloves. He was heading back to where Cutter was tied when he heard a sharp voice from the direction of the livery stable and saw a scene that tightened everything in him instantly. There were two men he didn't recognize, rough-looking. The kind of rough that was not just the wear of outdoor work, but something cultivated and used, leaning on the post outside the livery and speaking to Pearl Langston, who had apparently been walking past with a basket over her arm. One of the men had positioned himself slightly between her and the direction she was trying to walk, not blocking her exactly, but making the path uncomfortable. The other was saying something Nelson could not yet hear. Nelson had covered the distance between them before he had made a conscious decision to do so. "Just saying you ought to think seriously about Mr. Whitfield's generosity," the first man was saying as Nelson arrived. "He's not a man who stays generous forever." Pearl had her chin up and her grip tight on the basket handle, and she said, "Step aside, please." Neither man moved. Nelson stopped beside her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there and let his presence reconfigure the geometry of the situation, which was something he was good at, making it clear through stillness, and the particular quality of his attention that he was a man it would cost something to test. "These men bothering you?" he asked Pearl, though he was watching the two men when he said it. "Apparently," she said. The first man looked at Nelson with the quick, calculated look of a man deciding whether a threat is credible. Whatever he saw in Nelson's face, and Nelson made sure there was something there worth seeing, made him decide that it was. He straightened up, made a small gesture to his companion, and said, "Just having a conversation." "Conversation's over," Nelson said. The two men pushed off the post and walked away. Not running, because men like that needed not to run in public, but walking with a particular quality of haste underneath the casualness. Nelson stood next to Pearl and watched them go. Then he turned to look at her and found her looking at him with that same measuring expression from the first morning, but with something else in it now, something he couldn't entirely categorize. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "You were handling it." "I was," she said. Then after a pause, "Thank you anyway." He nodded and started to turn away, and she said, "Have you eaten this morning?" He had eaten. He turned back and said, "Not since early," which was technically true, and which was the moment Nelson Barnett fully admitted to himself that whatever careful, deliberate solitude he had constructed and maintained for 6 years had just developed its first serious crack. She fed him the best breakfast he had eaten, since he could clearly remember eggs cooked in a pan with some kind of herb he couldn't name, biscuits that were somehow both substantial and light, coffee that was again the same standard of excellence as the day before. He sat at her table and she sat across from him because the morning rush had not yet started, and she was, he understood, giving him something in return for the morning's service, which she would have done with dignity and without debt for anyone who had helped her. But she also talked to him. Not the way people talk to fill silence, but the way people talk when they are genuinely curious about something. "Where are you from?" she asked. "East Texas, originally. Nacogdoches." He said it like a man reading a fact from a record that concerned someone else. "You don't sound like you're from there anymore." "I've been a lot of places since." "How long have you been riding?" She asked, and there was nothing prying in it, just the question of someone who recognized a particular kind of tiredness in a person and wanted to understand it. 6 years, he said. She nodded like she understood something she hadn't been told directly. "After the war, the men who came back either settled immediately or they didn't settle for a very long time. My father was the same way." Nelson looked at her. "Your father was a soldier." "Confederate, yes. Came home in '65 with a leg that never healed right and a way of looking past things he didn't used to have. He built this place. Said he needed to put his hands on something permanent." She paused. "I think it helped him." Nelson didn't say anything for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at the grain of the wooden table and thought about Nacogdoches, and about a house he had grown up in that no longer contained the people it was supposed to contain, and about a particular September evening in 1876 when he had decided that the weight of staying anywhere too long was more than he was willing to carry. "Your mother?" he asked. "She passed when I was 11. It was just the two of us, and then it was just me." She said it without self-pity, which was one of the most remarkable things about Pearl Langston. She spoke of hard things as simple facts, stripped of all the dramatizing that was really just a demand for sympathy from whoever was listening. She was not asking him to feel sorry for her. She was just telling him the shape of her life, and somehow that plain honesty made him want to listen more than any performance of suffering could have. "What about you?" she asked. "Family? Mother? Brother? They're in Nacogdoches still, I expect." "You expect?" There was a gentle note of something, not judgment but curiosity, in the two words. "We don't write," he said. She looked at him for one long moment, and then she stood up to refill his coffee and said, very quietly, "That sounds lonely." Nobody had said that to him in years. People asked about him sometimes in the practical way of strangers. "Where are you from? Where are you going? What do you do?" Nobody said the thing underneath the thing. He looked at his coffee and did not speak for a moment, and then he said, "I suppose it is sometimes." That was, in its way, the most he had said to anyone in years. He left shortly after because customers started coming in, and Pearl had a business to run, and he had horses to tend in the afternoon. But he walked back to where Cutter was tied, feeling like a man who has been inside out of the cold for a while, and then walks back into the winter and notices for the first time, with fresh clarity, how cold it actually is. By the fourth day, Nelson Barnett had wanted nothing from anyone for so long that he had stopped being able to clearly name what wanting felt like. Pearl Langston had, in approximately 4 days, made him remember. He did not know what to do with that. He was not a man who typically felt confusion about what to do, but this confusion was particular and sharp, and had the quality, he thought, of something that was trying to grow rather than something trying to die away. He went back to the ranch and he broke horses for the rest of the day with unusual intensity, as if physical effort could settle the thing in his chest that had gotten loose. It couldn't. Over the next week, the visits to Pearl's eating house became a quiet pattern that neither of them directly acknowledged as a pattern. Nelson came in 2 or 3 mornings when he had reason to ride into town, and sometimes when he did not have strong reason, he found reason anyway. A need for some item from the general store, a message to deliver, some small practical errand that had perhaps less urgency than he presented to himself. Pearl always poured his coffee without being asked, which was the small, intimate act of a woman who has taken note of a person's preferences, and Nelson always paid for it, and for whatever he ate, which was his own form of honesty, making it a transaction so that no one could pretend it was nothing, which was the same as pretending it was something with no obligations. The town of Dusty Creek began to notice. Towns like that always noticed. 300 people in a collection of buildings in the Texas plain did not miss much, and Nelson was aware of the sidelong looks and the conversations that stopped when he walked into a room and then resumed at a slightly different volume after he left. He did not enjoy it, but he endured it with the same pragmatic tolerance with which he endured most things. Teddy Crane was the first person to say anything directly. He did it over supper at the ranch one evening with the complete fearlessness of someone who does not yet know how often fearlessness embarrasses a person. "People are saying you're sweet on Pearl Langston," Teddy said, spooning beans onto his plate. Nelson looked at him. "I'm just saying what people are saying," Teddy said, not quite shrinking but at least recalibrating. Eduardo heard it at the feed store. Eduardo, across the table, did not confirm or deny this, but continued eating with the serene neutrality of a man who knew that the wisest thing he could do at this moment was to be invisible. "People can say what they like," Nelson said. "Sure," Teddy said. "Is it true, though?" Nelson thought about Pearl's brown eyes and the flower on her cheek, and the steadiness of her voice when Whitfield had threatened her, and the way she had said that sounds lonely with the gentleness of someone who was not afraid of the truth of things. "Mind your plate, Teddy," he said. Teddy grinned into his beans. What Nelson was aware of, and what he turned over carefully in his mind during the long hours of work, was that his inclination toward Pearl was not the simple, quick-burning thing he had felt once or twice in his 20s and recognized as temporary. This was something different. This was the slow, particular gravity of one person being exactly the right shape for a space that has been empty so long you stopped believing the space existed. The problem was Whitfield. Nelson asked around, carefully, in the way a man can ask around a small town without making it obvious he is doing so, and what he learned about Silas Whitfield was not comforting. Whitfield owned the bank in Garfield, the county seat, 20 miles to the north. He was not a dishonest man in any way that could be proven in a court, but he was the kind of man who kept track of the gap between legal and right and used it as others use a tool. He had been trying to acquire the land Pearl's eating house sat on for 3 years, and his patience was not benevolent. It was strategic. He was waiting for Pearl to need something he could provide, at which point the need would become a lever. Nelson learned one more thing. That 6 months ago, Whitfield had got the town's previous lawman to resign under circumstances nobody would discuss plainly, and that the town of Dusty Creek had been operating since then with an appointed interim marshal named Hicks, who was Whitfield's cousin by marriage, and whose dedication to impartiality was accordingly limited. This information settled in Nelson like a heavy stone settling in still water, not agitating the surface, just changing the weight of the bottom. On a Thursday, 10 days after he had first ridden into Dusty Creek, Nelson came into the eating house in the mid-morning to find Pearl sitting at her own table with a letter in her hand, and an expression on her face that he had not seen there before. She had looked worried before, in the fast, suppressed way of a practical person who does not let worry run long. This was different. She was sitting very still, and the paper in her hand had the quality of something she had read more than once. He sat down across from her. After a moment she said, without looking up, "Whitfield's bank is calling in a note. A loan my father took out in '78 for repairs to the building. It was structured with a long repayment period, but there's a clause in it. I had a lawyer in Garfield read it once, and he said the clause was probably not enforceable, but probably and definitely are different things. That allows the bank to call it in full if they determine the property value has, in their judgment, declined." Nelson looked at the letter. "Can they do that?" "Whitfield's bank can say the property has declined in value because he determines value," she said, and now there was a sharpness in her voice that was the sound of controlled fury. "He's not wrong that he can probably make the argument. The question is what the county judge will say about it." "Who's the county judge?" "Harvey Prewitt. He's not Whitfield's man exactly, but he plays careful politics." She put the letter down on the table very precisely. "If I can't pay the note in full in 60 days, Whitfield's bank can petition for the property. If Prewitt rules in his favor, I lose the building." Nelson was quiet for a moment. "How much is the note?" she told him. It was not an impossible sum, but it was a very significant one for a single woman running a small eating house and dry goods store in a town of 300 people. She had, she said, been putting money aside carefully for 3 years since her father's death, but not enough. She was short by a meaningful amount, and 60 days was not long enough to make up the difference through normal business. "I'll give you a loan," Nelson said. Pearl looked at him with an expression that was genuinely startled, not insulted, not immediately dismissive, just honestly surprised. "Nelson, I have money saved," he said. 6 years of wages and no expenses worth mentioning. It's just sitting in a bank in Fort Worth. I can wire for it." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a wagon rolled past slowly. The fire in the stove made its small, patient sounds. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He considered lying or softening it. which was what a man was supposed to do in that situation. But Pearl Langston was not a woman who deserved anything but the plain thing. "Because you've been standing up against him alone for 3 years," he said, "and because this town should have what you put into it." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Her brown eyes had that reading quality, the way she looked at something she wanted to understand all the way through. "I can't accept a loan from you without something formal in writing," she said. "I won't be indebted informally to anyone." "Agreed," he said. "We'll draw up proper terms. Same interest the bank would charge, same structure. You don't owe me anything except what's fair." She looked at the letter again. Then she said, "Why are you really still here, Nelson? You have a horse to break and then you were going to move on. That's the kind of man you are, it's written all over you." He thought about this for longer than was probably comfortable to watch. Then he said, "I'm beginning to think maybe that's not the only kind of man I am." The silence that followed was one of those silences that has actual weight. Pearl Langston looked at Nelson Barnett across the wooden table in her eating house in Dusty Creek, Texas in the spring of 1882, and something shifted between them that was not named yet but was undeniably real. "All right," she said at last. "I'll accept the loan with proper terms, and Nelson, thank you." He nodded, stood up, and put on his hat. "I'll ride to Garfield Monday and wire Fort Worth." He was at the door when she said, "You never asked me if the food was good." He stopped and turned around. "I kept coming back," he said. "That was my opinion." She smiled then. For the first time he had seen a real full smile from her, and it changed her face completely, not making her younger exactly, but taking something careful and defended out of her expression and replacing it with something warm and open and true. He had to look away first. He walked out into the April sunshine and stood by Cutter for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck and the image of Pearl smiling burning in his chest like a brand. The Monday trip to Garfield was uneventful. Nelson wired the Fort Worth bank, arranged the transfer, and stopped at a lawyer's office in Garfield to have a proper loan agreement drawn up, clear terms, fair interest, the kind of document that protected Pearl and made everything clean. He brought the agreement back to Dusty Creek, and they sat at her table in the quiet of the early afternoon before the supper customers arrived, and they both signed it, and Pearl folded her copy and put it in the small iron box she kept under the counter, and Nelson folded his and put it inside his coat. "I'll make the payment to Whitfield's bank this week," she said. "I'll ride with you if you want a witness," Nelson said. She looked at him. "You do that. I do that." She nodded slowly. "Thursday," she said. They rode to Garfield on Thursday, Pearl on her dun mare Stella and Nelson on Cutter, side by side on the long flat road through the mesquite country. It was a bright, cool day with high white clouds and the kind of April light that makes the Texas plain look like something painted with intention. They talked for most of the 20 miles. This was the longest uninterrupted time Nelson had spent with another person in years, and what surprised him was not that it was difficult. It wasn't, but that it felt like the most natural thing he had done in longer than he could measure. Pearl told him about growing up in Dusty Creek, about her father teaching her the dry goods business before he taught her to read, about the way the town had grown in 15 years from a water stop on the stage road to an actual community with a school and a church, and people who intended to stay. She talked about the women's community in the town, the churchwomen who organized and coordinated and knew everything about everyone and made the actual social fabric of the place, and about Martha Hale, who ran the school and was Pearl's closest friend, and about the particular loneliness of being the one person in your immediate circle who was not married. "How old are you?" Nelson asked at one point. 26, she said. "And before you say whatever men say when they hear that, I'll tell you that I've had offers. I've turned them down because they were offers made for reasons that had more to do with what I own than who I am." "I wasn't going to say anything like that," he said. She looked at him sideways. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say I'm 28, he said, "and that I've been a poor prospect for anyone for 6 years, and I know it." She was quiet for a moment, the horse's hooves making their rhythmic sound on the hard road. Then she said, "What made you that way, really?" He had not told this to anyone in a very long time. He looked at the road ahead and the way the heat was beginning to shimmer off it even in the April cool, and he said, "There was a woman in Nacogdoches. We were young, I was 22. We were going to be married. She died of fever in the summer of '76. And the grief of it, it wasn't just the grief of losing her. It was that I'd let myself need things. A future, a place, a particular person in it. And when it was gone, I couldn't figure out how to want those things again without it feeling like setting myself up for the same thing." He paused. "So I just stopped wanting them." Pearl said nothing for a long time. The road wound through a stand of cedar and came out the other side into open grassland. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "about her." "Thank you," he said. "And I'm sorry you spent 6 years not wanting things," she said. And there was something in it that was not pity, it was something more honest than that, something close to grief on his behalf, which was the most tender thing anyone had offered him in a very long time. "You seem like a man who has a lot of good wanting in him." He looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead, her copper hair catching the light, and she had the composed expression of someone who has just said a true thing and is waiting to see what the air does with it. "Pearl," he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and then he said, "I think you might be dangerous." She raised an eyebrow. On account of I've been riding for 6 years without wanting to stop anywhere," he said. "And then I rode into Dusty Creek 4 days ago, and I've found 11 reasons to stay longer than I planned." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she turned back to the road with the smallest smile at the corner of her mouth and said, "There are probably 12 reasons if you count the coffee." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and is not performed for anyone's benefit, and it surprised him, and he saw from the way Pearl glanced at him that it surprised her too, not the laugh itself but the warmth of it, as if she hadn't expected him to be capable of it. They arrived in Garfield and went directly to the bank. Whitfield was in his office, and the clerk who showed them and made a show of neutrality that covered his obvious discomfort at being in the middle of whatever this was. Whitfield looked at Pearl and then at Nelson and then back at Pearl with the particular expression of a man recalculating. Pearl put the payment on his desk. "Full amount," she said. "Certified bank draft from the First National in Fort Worth. I expect a receipt and a release of the clause." Whitfield looked at the draft for a long moment. Nelson stood just behind Pearl's shoulder, not saying anything, his presence doing its work the way it had with the men at the livery stable. "This is unexpected," Whitfield said. "I imagine it is," Pearl said. He counted the draft, which was theater, he knew what it was, and then he wrote out a receipt slowly, with the deliberate slowness of a man trying to find something in the situation he could use. He found nothing. He handed Pearl the receipt and the signed release, and he looked at Nelson and said, "Friend of yours." "He is," Pearl said simply, and she picked up the documents, put them in her bag, and walked out of the office with her back straight and her chin level, and Nelson followed her. And they were out of the bank, and on the board walkway before Pearl let out a breath that was quiet and long and contained 6 years of held tension. Nelson watched her and did not speak because he understood that some moments need space around them to land fully. After a moment she said, 3 years. 3 years of that man thinking he had me cornered." She turned to look at Nelson, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly but was close to them, the brightness of a held thing finally released. "Thank you," she said. "Nelson, genuinely, thank you." "You did the work," he said. "I just wired some money." "You just wired some money," she repeated, and there was a warmth in how she said it that made the plain words carry something else entirely. They rode back to Dusty Creek in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind them and pulling their shadows long ahead of them on the road. It was an easier ride back, easier in the way that a body is when it has put down something it was carrying too long. They talked differently, too lighter, without the particular watchfulness that had been in both of them before. Pearl laughed at something Nelson said about Teddy Crane and his romantic ambitions, and the sound of it in the open air of the Texas plain was something Nelson thought he would like to hear for a considerable number of years if he could figure out how to arrange it. He stayed on for the rest of the spring at the Delmer Ranch. He did not discuss this decision with anyone in particular. He just kept working past the date when he might normally have moved on, and Delmer was pleased enough to keep paying him, and the horses got broke, and Nelson rode into Dusty Creek several times a week and ate Pearl's food and drank her coffee, and they talked about everything. Her plans for the eating house, the history of the county, his travels, what Texas had been like before the cattle trail era changed it. The politics of water rights that were just beginning to become the source of conflict that everyone in the Western Territories could see coming. One evening in late May, Nelson stayed past the supper rush helping Pearl move a heavy shelf unit that had been leaning slightly for a year and had finally hit the angle where it needed addressing. They moved it together, repositioned the supports, and Nelson found himself standing very close to Pearl in the narrow space between the shelf and the counter, and she was looking up at him in the fading light from the window, and the moment had a particular quality of stillness that was not still at all. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to keep finding reasons to stay in Dusty Creek indefinitely?" she said. "Or is there a point at which you're going to say the actual thing?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I want to stay," and after a pause, because he was not a man who did this kind of thing without meaning it completely, "I want to stay here with you if you'll have that." Pearl looked at him steadily. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to be with, I've been told. I have opinions and I run my own business, and I'm not interested in someone who wants me to be smaller." "I know that," he said. "And you should know," she continued, "that I've been alone and managed it, and I'd rather be alone than be with someone who's only half present." "I know that too," he said. "All right," she said. And then, with the directness that was one of the finest things about her, "Then I want that too." He kissed her then in the evening light in her eating house in Dusty Creek, Texas, and it was not a tentative thing, but it was also not a rough thing. It was the kiss of two people who have been paying very careful attention to each other and have finally arrived at the place where the attention becomes something you can put your hands on. June in Dusty Creek was hot and busy, and Nelson Barnett was a changed man by degrees that were not dramatic but were complete. He moved out of the ranch hand's bunk and rented a room in the boarding house on Main Street, which was a practical decision but also a social one. It placed him in the town rather than on the edge of it. He continued working for Delmer through the summer because Delmer needed him, and because the work was good, and because the income mattered, but he was also spending his spare hours doing something he had not done in 6 years, which was becoming part of a place. He met Martha Hale, Pearl's schoolteacher friend, who was a small, sharp-eyed woman with a dry wit who assessed Nelson in one conversation, and apparently decided he was adequate, which Pearl told him was the highest praise Martha gave anyone. He met the Reverend Josiah Cole at the church, who was the kind of minister who had spent enough time in the West to have a pragmatic and unshockable relationship with human nature. He met various members of the town's business community and its farming families and its complicated social topography, which, like all such topographies, had its grievances and its alliances and its unspoken rules. He also developed an understanding, through careful attention, of just how much Pearl Langston was the center of the town's unofficial welfare. She gave credit at the dry goods counter to families who were between harvests. She kept the eating house open late on nights when she knew a particular family was traveling in. She had been, quietly and without ever making it a public thing, one of the primary ways the town held together in the lean years following the drought of 1879. The town knew it, even if they didn't say it plainly, and the way the women at the church looked at Pearl, with a respect that was also a kind of love, told Nelson more about the character of the woman than anything she had said about herself, because Pearl never said anything about herself that was complimentary. Whitfield made one more attempt. In July, he sent a man to Dusty Creek, not the rough types from the livery, but a lawyer this time, which was a different kind of attempt with a new proposition. The lawyer presented it as a business partnership, an offer to bring capital into the eating house and expand it, which was transparently a bid for ownership under a different name. Pearl listened to the whole presentation with her characteristic patience, and then she said, "Please tell Mr. Whitfield that this business is not for partnership, sale, or any arrangement that diminishes my sole ownership of it, now or in the future. Thank you for the ride out." The lawyer left. Nelson, who had been sitting at the end of the counter eating a piece of pie through the entire presentation, said nothing until the door closed and then said, "You know he's not going to stop entirely." "I know," Pearl said, "but he's running out of angles. Once you're completely out of debt to him, there's nothing left for him to pull on. The land is mine clear, the building is mine clear. He can keep trying, but trying gets expensive." She looked thoughtful. "I spoke to Judge Pruitt directly last month, by the way, took the train to the county seat and sat in his office for an hour and laid out the whole history. Pruitt is a political man, but he's not an unjust one, and he does not like being used as Whitfield's instrument. I believe he made that clear to Whitfield." Nelson looked at her. "You did that on your own." "I did. When were you going to tell me?" She smiled. "I'm telling you now." He shook his head, but it was the shaking head of a man deeply impressed rather than anything else. "You are remarkable," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "Those can be the same thing," he said. And she looked at him with a look that was warm and a little surprised, as if she hadn't expected to be seen quite that clearly. And he understood that one of the things Pearl Langston had not had nearly enough of in her life was someone paying genuine attention to what she actually was rather than what the category of her seemed to demand. In August, Nelson made a decision that he had been approaching for several weeks the way he approached difficult horses, not rushing, not forcing, just letting the right moment declare itself. On a Sunday afternoon, he and Pearl were sitting on the bench outside her eating house in the shade of the awning, the town quiet around them with its Sunday quiet, and Nelson said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it right." Pearl looked at him with those eyes. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to stay in Dusty Creek permanently. I have enough saved that between the two of us we could put a proper addition on this building, expand the eating house, add to the dry goods side, build this thing into what you've always had the capacity for." He paused. "I'm not saying this because I want to provide for you, because you've made it more than clear you don't need that. I'm saying it because I want to build something with you. I want to stop moving and I want to stop being alone, and I want to do both of those things specifically with you. Because you are." He stopped for a moment, because the next part was the part that required the most honesty, and Nelson Barnett's honesty was thorough even when it was uncomfortable. "You are the first person I've met in 6 years who made the world feel like it had enough room in it for me to put something down and stay." Pearl was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the road in front of the eating house, at the familiar shape of Dusty Creek on its Sunday afternoon, and then she turned and looked at Nelson with an expression that was fully open in a way he had not seen from her before, without the measuring and the careful management, just open. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Nelson." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat there in the August shade without needing to fill the moment with anything else, which was the best kind of moment, full already, asking nothing more. They were married in October, in the church with the bell that needed paint, which Pearl had arranged to have painted the week before the wedding because she said she had been meaning to organize it for 2 years, and this was a good occasion to finally do it. The Reverend Cole performed the ceremony. Martha Hale stood up for Pearl. Teddy Crane stood up for Nelson, which would have surprised Nelson 6 months earlier, but was the natural outcome of having spent a summer being slowly befriended by someone who did not accept indifference as a final answer. Eduardo from the Delmer Ranch came as well, sitting in the third pew with the quiet dignity of a man who has seen many things and knows what to take seriously. The whole of Dusty Creek came, more or less. 300 people and their collective opinion had shifted entirely between April and October, going from the speculative interested watching of a town, observing a stranger, to the warm participatory celebration of a community claiming two of its own. Mrs. Carver from the Churchwoman's Committee brought a cake that was 4 layers and decorated with real flowers. The blacksmith brought a gift of iron candle holders he had made himself. Horace Delmer, who was a sentimental man under his practicality, cried quietly in the back row and pretended he had something in his eye. Pearl wore a dress the color of cream, not white because she was practical about what would stain, and she had her copper hair pinned up with small flowers in it that Martha Hale had gathered that morning from the creek bank. She was the most beautiful thing Nelson Barnett had ever seen, not in the way that beauty is usually meant, as a quality that belongs to faces and shapes, but in the way that something is beautiful when it is exactly what it is supposed to be. Nothing more concealed, nothing more added, just the whole of itself standing in the light. When the Reverend Cole asked Nelson if he took this woman, Nelson looked at Pearl and said yes with a directness that made the Reverend smile, because he had performed enough marriages to know the difference between a man who says it and a man who means it. They moved into the set of rooms above the eating house that Pearl had occupied alone for 3 years, and they made it their home together, which required the small negotiations of 2 independent people learning the geometry of shared space. Nelson was a tidy man by the habits of travel, which helped. Pearl had been alone long enough to have strong opinions about where things belonged, and Nelson's opinion on most of those things was that he deferred to hers, which was not weakness but wisdom. There were conversations about a few things that required actual compromise, and they had those conversations with the same directness they brought to everything, which made them much shorter than they might have been. The expansion of the eating house happened that fall. Nelson put his savings in, Pearl put hers in, and they hired 2 men from town to do the building work under Nelson's direction. By December, they had a proper dining room that could seat 20 people instead of 10, a larger kitchen with a better wood stove, and an expanded dry goods section with more shelving. Pearl hired a young woman named Rosa Fuentes, who was 17 and who had been helping her mother take in laundry for 3 years, to help with the counter work and the cooking preparation. Pearl taught her methodically, and with patience, and Rosa proved to be quick and careful and grateful for work that paid fairly. Dusty Creek noticed the expansion and responded to it. The eating house became a genuine center of the town's communal life, not just food, but the kind of gathering that small western towns desperately needed, a neutral, warm space where farmers and merchants and their families could sit together and eat something good and exchange the 10,000 small informational transactions that are the actual material of community. Nelson was often at the counter in the evenings when the work at the ranch was done, and he had a quality, the quality of a man who did not talk unless he had something to say, that people found comfortable. They would sit beside him and talk, and he would listen and occasionally say the exact right thing, and the word got around that the man Pearl Langston had married was, despite his quiet, a good man to know. By the following spring, Horace Delmer had proposed something Nelson had not expected. He was getting on in years, and Eduardo was aging too, and Teddy Crane was leaving. Teddy had met the girl in the next town and was going there, and Delmer wanted to sell the ranch to someone he trusted to keep running it well rather than let it go to speculators. He offered Nelson first right of purchase at a very fair price. Nelson sat with this for a week. He sat with it with Pearl, who was the person he sat with everything now, not because he needed someone to make decisions for him, but because he had discovered that thinking out loud with Pearl sharpened his thinking in ways that 6 years of solitary deliberation had never managed. "What do you want?" Pearl asked him, which was always her first question, delivered simply, without any indication of what answer she was hoping for. "I love working horses," he said. "I've always been good with them. And the ranch is a good property, the water situation is solid and the land is sound." He looked at his hands. But it would mean being out there most days, less time here. We could hire someone for the evenings, Pearl said. Rosa is getting good, and the business can support another wage. You'd be all right with that, me being out at the ranch, she looked at him. Nelson, you don't need my permission to do work you love. I know I don't, he said. I'm asking if you'd be content, that's different. She considered him for a moment with that particular look of hers, the one that went all the way through a person. I would be content, she said, if you are here in the evenings and present in our life. The geography of the days doesn't trouble me. He bought the Delmer Ranch in May of 1883. Eduardo stayed on. Eduardo apparently intended to work that land until the land itself asked him to stop, and Nelson hired 2 new hands and began running the property in earnest, breeding quarter horses, and breaking the 3- and 4-year-olds that ranches across the county needed. He was good at it in a way that went beyond technique. The horses knew something about him, and that knowing was worth money. Life in Dusty Creek settled into a shape that was full and good and specific, in the way that only a life actually rooted somewhere becomes specific. The eating house in the mornings was Pearl's domain, and Nelson came through it for his coffee, and sometimes stayed to eat, and always said goodbye properly before he rode out to the ranch, not as a habit performed without feeling, but because he understood what goodbyes were worth. In the evenings he came back and they sat together over the accounts and talked about the day, and sometimes just sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have learned to rest in each other's presence. There were difficulties, because life had them. There was a drought in the summer of 1883 that stressed the ranch and forced Nelson to make hard decisions about the horse inventory. There was a conflict with a family named Briggs, who claimed the eastern fence line of the ranch property was set wrongly, and this required a survey and 3 months of tense legal correspondence before it was resolved in Nelson's favor. There was a season when Pearl's health was not right, nothing dangerous, the town doctor said, just exhaustion accumulated and running too hard for too long, and Nelson spent that month doing more of the cooking than Pearl, and managing the eating house counter more directly, which meant learning things he had not known before about provisioning and preparation, and the particular art of making people feel welcome at a table. He was not bad at it. Pearl watched him from the back room where she was supposed to be resting but mostly wasn't, and she said one evening, "You know, you could have run this place." "I'm a horseman," he said. "You're a man who pays attention to what people need," she said. "That's the same skill." He thought about this. "You're the one who taught me that." She shook her head. "I showed you where you already had it." He looked at her, his wife of a year and a few months, sitting in the light of the lamp with her copper hair loose around her shoulders the way it was in the evenings, and he felt the familiar thing that he never quite had a word for, the feeling of being in the exact right place doing the exact right thing with the exact right person, which was the most complicated and the most simple feeling a man could have. In February of 1884, Pearl told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, before the eating house opened, sitting across from him at the table where he'd first drunk her coffee and first noticed the particular quality of her. She told him plainly, in her way, watching his face for his reaction the way she watched things she needed to understand. Nelson was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Pearl and then past her at the room and then back at Pearl, and he was thinking about all the ways a person could be startled by something they had not known they needed to want, and then finally, after all the waiting, found themselves fully wanting. He got up from his chair, went around the table, and he knelt beside her chair and took her hands and said, "Are you well? Is everything is fine," she said, with her characteristic steadiness. "The doctor says all signs are good." "Pearl," he said, and he didn't say anything else for a moment, and she looked at him and her eyes were warm and a little bright, and he brought her hands to his mouth and pressed them there, not as a performance, but as the only gesture big enough for what he was feeling. She rested her forehead against his and they stayed like that for a moment in the quiet of the morning. "I was beginning to think," he said very quietly, that I'd used up all my good luck before I got here. You clearly hadn't, she said. He laughed, which was what she always made him do when he was in danger of becoming too solemn, and she laughed with him. And Rosa arrived at the back door for work and found the two of them laughing together at the table, and assumed it was just another morning and went to start the stove. And it was just another morning, but it was also every morning from here forward, which was the finest kind of ordinary. The summer brought more changes to Dusty Creek that were larger than the personal. The railroad had been pushing steadily westward across Texas for years, and in the fall of 1884, it was announced that a spur line would come within 12 miles of Dusty Creek. This was the kind of news that changed everything. It meant goods cheaper, travel easier, connection to the wider world more direct. It also meant the town would grow, and growing towns attracted both good things and the people who followed good things with the intention of extracting them. Nelson and Pearl talked about what it meant for the eating house and for the ranch. The horse business would benefit from rail access enormously, getting horses to markets in Dallas and San Antonio without the expense and attrition of long drives was a significant change. The eating house was likely to see more traffic with more people moving through. They spent an evening with pencil and paper doing careful calculations that were also, underneath the practicality, a conversation about the future they were building and what shape they wanted it to have. Whitfield made one last attempt in October of that year, not through lawyers or rough men but personally, arriving in Dusty Creek and coming into the eating house at a quiet morning hour, and sitting down at Pearl's table with the air of a man who has decided to change tactics entirely. He was older looking than the last time Nelson had seen him, something around his eyes that spoke of a run of difficulty, though he still wore the good suit and the gold watch chain. Mrs. Barnett, he said, using the name that Nelson noticed with satisfaction carried a slight difficulty for Whitfield to produce. Pearl poured him coffee without being asked, because she would pour coffee for anyone who sat at her table regardless of what she thought of them, which was her own form of dignity. Mr. Whitfield, she said. I've sold the Garfield Bank, he said. I wanted you to know. Pearl looked at him with calm attention. I'm moving to San Antonio, he said. My daughter is there and my grandchildren, and I'm getting on. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup. I want to say before I go that I was not right in how I handled things with you. Your father made me a promise in friendship, and when he passed I tried to enforce it in ways that weren't fair to you. He looked up. I'm not asking anything, I just wanted to say it. Pearl was quiet for a moment. Nelson, who was behind the counter, did not move. I appreciate you saying that, Pearl said. Her voice was even, neither warm nor cold, but genuine. My father thought well of you for a long time. I hope San Antonio agrees with you. Whitfield nodded, finished his coffee, left a coin on the table that was more than the coffee cost, and walked out. Nelson watched him go through the window, an older man walking down the main road of a small town for the last time, making his particular peace with the shape of his life. Are you all right? Nelson asked Pearl. She thought about it honestly, which was her way. Yes, she said. I am actually. She looked at the door Whitfield had gone through. I held anger at that man for a long time. It was useful when I needed it. It's good to be able to put it down now. Their son was born on a bitter January morning in 1885. The labor was hard and long, and Nelson spent most of it on the wrong side of the door trying to be useful to the women, inside Martha Hale and the midwife, Mrs. Decker, who was a large, capable woman who had brought approximately 40 people into the world, and regarded anxiety in fathers as occupational background noise to be endured. Nelson had not known it was possible to be this frightened and this still at the same time, but he had been in enough truly dangerous situations to understand that panic was not useful, and so he channeled everything into quietness and waited. When Mrs. Decker opened the door at 9 in the morning and said, "Mother and son are fine, you can come in now," Nelson felt something in him that he did not entirely have words for except to say that it was the complete rearrangement of everything he understood about himself. Pearl was pale and tired and entirely present in the way that she always was, her copper hair dark with sweat and her eyes bright with exhaustion and something enormous and tender. She was holding a bundle that was their son, and when Nelson came to sit beside her, she turned the bundle so he could see the face red and new and furiously alive. "He looks angry," Nelson said. "He was warm and then he was cold," Pearl said. "I think his reaction is proportionate." Nelson put his hand very gently against his son's head. The baby's eyes, dark and unfocused, moved vaguely in the direction of this new warmth. "What shall we call him?" Pearl asked. Nelson had thought about this. He had thought about it for months, turning it over in the way he turned all important things over slowly from all angles until something settled. "Thomas," he said, "after your father if you like that." Pearl looked at him. Her father's name had been Thomas Langston, and she had never mentioned it as a consideration. It was just a thing Nelson had known and carried on his own, which she understood was entirely characteristic of him. Her eyes went very bright for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Barnett was a fact in the world from that January forward, growing with the particular relentless speed of the young, demanding and expressing and becoming in ways that made Nelson understand something he had heard many times as an abstraction and now knew as a physical reality. That love could multiply without dividing, that the heart was capable of more than it advertised. He was a dark-haired boy with Pearl's brown eyes and Nelson's solidity, and before he was a year old, he had established himself as a person with opinions, which his parents found hilarious and occasionally exhausting. The Dusty Creek of 1886 was different from the Dusty Creek Nelson had ridden into 4 years earlier. The railroad spur had come, and with it a small population increase, 2 new businesses, a bank operated by a man from Fort Worth who had no history with Whitfield and no inclination to produce one, and a steady increase in the families who were homesteading the surrounding land. The church bell had been painted and then painted again. The main road had been graded properly. There was talk of a second school. The Barnett eating house was the largest it had been, employing 4 people now including Rosa, who had developed from a careful apprentice into a genuinely gifted cook with particular skill in the kind of food that could feed a large table of hungry ranch workers and still have something beautiful about it. Pearl had given Rosa a raise twice and a partnership of sorts, a small percentage of the profits and genuine authority over the kitchen, and Rosa had responded to this trust with the loyalty of someone who had never been given a fair chance before and intended to prove the investment worth making. Nelson's horse ranch was thriving. The quarter horse breeding program he had developed was producing animals that ranches from 3 counties sought out, and the reputation for quality was the best kind of advertising. Eduardo was still there, slower now, doing less of the heavy work and more of the teaching. Because Nelson had hired 2 young hands and Eduardo, it turned out, had a gift for passing on knowledge that Nelson had not known about until he saw it in action. One evening in the late spring of 1887, Nelson and Pearl were sitting on the bench outside the eating house in what had become their evening ritual, Thomas asleep upstairs, the town settling into its evening, the air still warm from the day and beginning to cool. They were doing what they often did, which was nothing in particular and everything together. Pearl was leaning against Nelson's shoulder, and he had his arm around her in the easy way of 2 people who have been close long enough that closeness has become a form of rest. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Pearl asked. It was not an anxious question. She had no anxiety about the answer. It was just honest curiosity about the man beside her. Nelson thought about it genuinely. He thought about the 6 years of roads and arriving and leaving, the particular quality of never being known by any place he was in, the freedom that had also been the loneliness. "No," he said, "not anymore." "When did it stop?" she asked. He thought about this too. "About 4 days after I rode in," he said. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him, and he could see in her expression the recognition of what he meant, the memory of the first days. The crate of glass jars and the coffee and the conversation at the table and the men at the livery stable, and the morning she had asked him if the food was good and he had said, "I kept coming back." 4 days, she said. Approximately, he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that full, open look that she had shown him for the first time on the day he had asked her to be his wife, without the measuring and the management, just the whole truth of what she felt about him. "I'm glad you rode in," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every morning I think so." She settled back against his shoulder, and they sat there in the evening air of Dusty Creek, Texas, with the town going to its quiet, and the sky going through its colors, and the faint sound of Thomas turning in his sleep above them through the open window. In the years that followed, their family grew with the same steady, honest quality that had characterized everything between them. A second child came in 1888, a girl, born in the summer heat, who they named Clara after Nelson's mother. Clara arrived in the world with Pearl's directness and Nelson's dark eyes, and a temperament that was from the very beginning her own entirely unique property, which was not quite like either parent but was clearly related to both. She was fearless in the way of a child who has been given, by the particular quality of her parents' love, the foundation from which fearlessness grows naturally. Thomas was a big brother with the earnest seriousness of a child who takes responsibilities seriously, who would hold Clara's hand on the steps of the eating house with a proprietary attention that made Pearl smile every time she saw it. He had Pearl's way of looking at things carefully before he spoke about them, and Nelson's physical ease in the world. And by the time he was 4, he was already following Nelson to the horse yard on weekend mornings, and communicating something to the horses through his small, patient hands that made the older hands exchange quiet, knowing looks. Nelson watched his son with the horses one Saturday morning in the spring of 1889, the boy standing at the fence with his arms resting on the lower rail in a posture that was exactly Nelson's own, watching a new roan mare with the focused, quiet attention of someone who is learning something through observation rather than instruction. Nelson felt the familiar deep thing that he still did not have a complete word for, the feeling of the full and actual life he was living. He went back to the eating house and found Pearl at the kitchen counter, Clara on her hip babbling something important into Pearl's ear, Rosa at the big stove doing something with dried chilies and pork that smelled extraordinary. Pearl looked up when Nelson came in, and the look between them was the small daily one, not a grand thing but entirely real, the look of a man coming home and a woman seeing him come home, and both of them knowing exactly what they have in each other. "The mare settled," he said. "Thomas help?" Pearl asked. Stood there for an hour without making a sound. She came to the fence on her own. Pearl looked at him with a smile that was also a knowing thing. "He has it," she said. "He does," Nelson said. He poured himself coffee, Pearl's coffee, which was still after 7 years the best coffee he had ever drunk, and sat at the table that had been the first place he had ever sat in Pearl Langston's world, and listened to the sounds of his household. Clara's running commentary on something only she fully understood, Rosa's quiet, efficient movements, Pearl's voice asking a question about the morning supply order, the distant sound from outside of Dusty Creek going about its Saturday business. The man who had ridden into Dusty Creek in April of 1882, wanting nothing from anyone, sat at that table, and felt the specific weight of what he now had, not a burden, but the weight of something real and complete, the kind of gravity that keeps a person present in the world rather than moving through it unattached. He thought sometimes about the self that had ridden in on Cutter with his hat pulled low, and his solitude arranged around him like armor, and his deliberate, careful plan to pass through without leaving or receiving anything. He thought about it with a kind of fond clarity, the way a person thinks about a younger version of themselves who was doing the best they could with what they understood at the time. That man had not been wrong, exactly. He had needed what he had built for himself in order to survive what he had survived. He had just needed Pearl Langston to show him that survival and living were not the same thing. Pearl had not done it by force or by manipulation, or by making herself necessary through any calculated act. She had done it by simply being what she was, direct and warm and strong and funny, and entirely present in the world, until the man who had been absent from his own life for 6 years couldn't look away. 4 days, approximately. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, Nelson and Pearl walked out to the bench in front of the eating house after Thomas and Clara were asleep, which was something of a production every night with 2 children who had opinions about bedtime. The October air had the particular clarity of the Texas fall, cool and dry and smelling of cedar on the wind. The town was quiet around them. The stars above the flat country were the staggering multitude of stars you can only see far from cities, which Dusty Creek still was and hoped to remain for a while yet. Pearl leaned against Nelson and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the street and the dark buildings and the stars above the rooftops. And Nelson thought about the road that had brought him here, the long 6 years of it, the 3 days from the Brazos, the April morning, the crate of glass jars. 7 years, Pearl said. And some days, Nelson said. She laughed quietly. You always add the days. The days count, he said. She turned her head to look up at him, and in the starlight her face was something that would have struck a traveling stranger as simply a pretty woman's face, the copper hair, silvering slightly at the temples now, the lines at the corners of her eyes that were the record of her particular kind of life, the brown eyes with their reading quality that had not changed at all. But Nelson was not a traveling stranger. Nelson was the man who had watched every season of her face for 7 years and knew what each line and each light in her eyes had cost and what it was worth, which was everything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I was an idiot for 6 years," he said. She shook her head. "You were carrying something heavy," she said. "You put it down when you were ready." "You made me ready," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "We made each other ready, Nelson, that's how it works." He kissed her then in the October night, their 7th anniversary, on the bench in front of the place they had built together, with their children sleeping upstairs and the horses on the eastern land and the town around them that knew them both and kept them both. And it was a kiss that was everything a beginning had been and everything a whole life had grown into, which was not the same kind of fire as the very first but was larger and truer, and the kind of warmth a person can live inside rather than just remember. The stars above Dusty Creek were extravagant and indifferent and entirely beautiful. Nelson Barnett had ridden into this town on a gray April morning wanting nothing from anyone, carrying his solitude like something he had chosen and might never put down, planning to stay only long enough to earn his wages and move on. Pearl Langston had undone all of that in approximately 4 days. He was grateful for it every single morning of every year that followed, and he was not quiet about being grateful, which was perhaps the greatest change of all, that a man who had spent 6 years speaking to no one but his horse had become a man who found it necessary and right and true to tell his wife, with regularity and without embarrassment, that she was the finest thing that had ever happened to him. Pearl, for her part, always received this with the particular directness that was her nature, not dismissing it as unnecessary, not performing gratitude for it, but meeting it with her clear brown eyes and saying simply, "And you to me." And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was exactly right. The Barnett eating house stood on the main road of Dusty Creek for many years after, and people came from 3 counties to eat Pearl's food and sit at the long wooden tables and feel the particular hospitality of the place, which was not the hospitality of performance, but of genuine welcome, the welcome of a woman who believed in the fundamental importance of people being fed and warm and seen, and a man who had learned from 6 years of moving that the best thing a person can do with their life is put it somewhere real and let it grow. Thomas eventually took over the horse ranch, and Clara, as it turned out, had something of her mother's gift for business and something of her father's gift for reading people. And eventually she had the best law practice in that part of Texas, which was a thing her parents were proud of in the particular way of people who never pushed their children toward anything specific, but made them strong enough to find their own specific thing and go after it. The bench outside the eating house became a Dusty Creek landmark of sorts, a specific kind of landmark that is not official and has no plaque, but that everyone in a town knows the meaning of. The bench where Nelson and Pearl Barnett sat in the evenings, where the two of them could be found when the work was done and the children were in, and the town was going to its rest, where two people sat for 30 years and more and were unmistakably, entirely, permanently at home. Nelson kept his hat and his horse and his laconic way of speaking, because some things are genuinely a man's nature and not just his armor. But he also kept Pearl's hand in his and Pearl's voice in his ear, and the particular education in living that she had offered him beginning on the second morning he walked into her shop. The education that said, a person does not have to move in order to be free, that it is possible to put yourself down in a place and let it be permanent, and not have the permanence become a cage but instead become a foundation, which is what all good permanence finally is. He had wanted nothing from anyone when he rode in. She had given him everything, starting from practically the first day, and what made it possible for him to receive it was that she had never given it as charity or as an obligation or as a claim. She had just been herself, fully and without apology, in the way that truly strong people are themselves, and he had learned from watching her how to do the same. That was the gift. Not love in the simple pretty sense of songs and poems, though there was plenty of that too, but the specific gift of a person who shows you, by being entirely themselves, that it is safe to be entirely yourself, that it is not only safe but necessary, that the world has more room in it than a grieving and guarded young man riding alone through the Texas plain had given it credit for. The room was there. It had always been there. It just took one particular woman in a shop on a spring morning in Dusty Creek, Texas, with flour on her left cheek and a crate of glass jars she nearly dropped, to show him the door.